Hello and welcome to Chapter 2, the Constitution lecture, the first lecture in your first module. So I go through the chapters fairly quickly. Um, this isn't a substitute for reading the material. Make sure you are reading the material first and taking the quiz and all of that good stuff. So we start out with what led to the revolution. And many of you already have learned bits of this. Many of you are learning more by reading the text and hearing some of the contextual issues of the time. But there were several things that led to the War for Independence and the Revolutionary War. So no taxation without representation. Uh, this had started, the French and Indian War was a very large-scale war in what is now the United States and Canada. And to fund this war, the British, who controlled the area at the time, and the French, who were in parts of Canada, what is now Canada, what we now call Quebec, and into other parts of Canada as well. They needed to fund the war. And so how they chose to fund the war, one of the many different ways, was to create taxes. And these taxes affected the colonial settlers, and they weren't too happy about it, as no one says hip hip hooray when they have to pay more taxes. And if they do, they probably need some sort of mental help. That being said, we have to pay for government, and that requires taxes. So you had the taxes, you had trade restrictions, and this hurt businesses in the colonies. And as you read in the text, prior to the French and Indian War, the colonies, the 13 colonies that would end up making the United States, had developed kind of an independent life outside of the British Crown. There was a lot more freedom of religion. You didn't have a state church. You had lots of groups, different groups from Europe with different religions. You had lots of trading going on. The New World was seen as the major source of raw materials. So there's a lot of money and trade all over the world. And so when the British decided, well, we're going to create some taxes, get some of this revenue for ourselves, and forbid certain trading to certain countries who are siding with the French, etc., this upset those new merchant class which had grown in the United States at the time. So this, over the course of many different taxes that we read about in the text, culminated with several different things, one of which was the Committees of Correspondence. If you remember in the text, this was put together by Samuel Adams. Yes, that Samuel Adams, who they put the face of on the beer. If you remember in the text, it does tell us that Samuel Adams actually bankrupted his family's brewery. So he was known more as a revolutionary and less as an astute brewer. The Coercive Acts of 1774, also known as the Intolerable Acts. This was more of a reaction by the British against the US protesting things like the Stamp Act and some others that we read about in the text. And so they said, okay, you want to play with us, we'll play with you. And certain new impositions were put on the colonists, particularly one of note is quartering of British troops. This means that the British troops are forced to stay with colonist families, whether they like it or not, and those families have to provide food and everything else for these people who are oppressing them. Not always a popular policy choice. So the First Continental Congress was put together, as we read, and initially it was not put together for independence. It was put together to create a Congress that represented the colonies so that they could vote on matters such as taxes that affect them. And in September 1774, you had the Declaration of Rights and Resolves for English Cooperation. Again, this wasn't asking for independence. This was asking to cooperate with Britain and the Crown. The Crown said, no, thank you. And then you had the Second Continental Congress, which was actually promised in the First Continental Congress that if you don't give us these abilities, and there's several listed in the text, then we will have a Second Continental Congress. And This time they created the Olive Branch Petition, this reaching out to the Crown and Britain once again, say, hey, we can all work together, can't we all get along? And the king at that time said, oh, heck no, and really decided to turn the screws a little tighter on the colonists. And this gave way to the movement switching now to independence from Britain. More trade restrictions. You had, of course, the Tea Party, and then the continuation of the Tea Act and the monopoly with the East India Tea Company and all of those things. During this time, a publication was put together called Common Sense, and that was Thomas Paine's created. Initially, he said anonymous, but then he's like, wow, this thing's really selling, so he put his name on it. And Benjamin Franklin was the publisher, and this was a book in half of the households of the colonists, which is amazing. If you can think in terms of now 330 million people, that half of those 165 million would have this book, accessible to them. That's pretty amazing. And this really turned the tide. It made the case for independence. So things changed. The movement now with these organized groups, the king again had said, screw you, and actually declared all those who met in the Second Continental Congress as treasonous, and therefore had the punishment of death. So it was done. And they decided we need a Declaration of Independence. You had several different versions that were proposed in states, but the Committee of Five came together and created the official Declaration of Independence, and that was John Adams of Massachusetts, later became president, Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, Thomas Jefferson of Virginia, who's credited with writing most of the Declaration of Independence, Robert R. Livingston of New York, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. It drew a lot from what was called the Enlightenment period, and the Enlightenment theorists and philosophers, one of whom was John Locke. You also had Rousseau, who was French, and they articulated about a social contract theory. So a person's moral or political obligations are dependent upon a contract or agreement to form the society in which they live. So it's those that are govern, the people, have a contract with those in power that this must be to their liking, or it shall be replaced, and that they owe the government comes from the people, as Rousseau would say. So life, liberty, and property. We see pursuit of happiness often put there, but John Locke was more to the point, saying property, and that was a major concern, of course, for the original revolutionaries, as many were wealthy property owners and wanted to make sure that their property was protected and not infringed upon by the crown or anyone else from Europe. So reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who could but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. And of course, pursuit of happiness was changed from the Locke text in the Declaration itself. So this formed a new government. You had the Revolutionary War ending several years later, and the government of the United States looked very different from the way it does now. And as you read in the text, it was a confederation or confederacy, not to be confused later with the Confederacy in the Civil War 70 years later. But confederacy means that it's a loose association of states. So the states still had all of the power. The federal government just was kind of a very weak binding committee that would facilitate things between the states. Most importantly, during the Revolutionary War, where they had the Articles of Confederation, the federal government primarily served as to organize troops in action against the British. Now that the war was over, the federal government didn't do much. They tried to, but oftentimes were not successful. So the first federal government, there was no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, no executive branch to implement laws. So no president or like figure. You did have a president, but this was just the person who presided over the federal government, the Congress, and really had no power at all. Just that's where the name president comes from, presides. So there were several presidents actually before George Washington. However, they had very little to no power. No federal judicial system, no coercive power over states. And this came to fruition with Shays' Rebellion, as you see in the picture here. You had farmers protesting farm foreclosures. Some wealthy folks in Massachusetts decided that they were going to be cute and have all of these farmers pay all of their debts in cash. And the farmers said no. And then they started foreclosing. And then 1,500 farmers came up, many of whom had fought in the Revolutionary War, and just took over the State House and said, you're not foreclosing on anyone anymore. And when they went to the states, as you read, the states were unwilling to pay for a militia to step in. Only one state would, Virginia. The others would not. The federal government had to finally put together a group to stop the insurrection. And it was a terrible situation, and it showed that the Articles of Confederation really didn't work. You also had states going to war against each other. Different states had certain treaties with some countries versus others. Different states were printing their own currency. It was a mess. So this led to the Constitutional Convention. They said this Articles of Confederation are not working. Virginia plan came in. Virginia at the time was the most populous state, and they were one of the large states like New York, and they had wanted a powerful central government, and they want representation based on population. They didn't like that the Articles of Confederation had each state having one vote. So you'd have a very tiny state, like Rhode Island or Delaware or southern states that had low population would have the same power as Virginia or New York. They didn't care for that. In response, New Jersey, which at the time was a small state, proposed a plan that was different. The New Jersey plan favored a government similar to the Articles of Confederation. A great compromise, which came from the Connecticut plan, as you read, was that, okay, we see the differences in the plan. We'll adopt most of the Virginia plan, but what we will do is for the bicameral legislature, which means there's two different groups that comprise Congress. One, the House of Representatives, will be based on the population and directly elected by the people. However, we'll keep the element of states having equal vote in the Senate. And those will be, either one at the time, they didn't know one or two or however many, but it'll be an equal number of senators from each state who are elected by the state legislatures. So that was the compromise. And let's look at the framers, and who they were. These were the people debating this. Obviously, the majority were not poor. They were well-to-do landowners. As you see, as far as the occupations of the framers, the vast majority were attorneys, were lawyers. And then you had several other groups, but the one constant among most all of them, whether they were listed as a farmer or inventor or teacher, is that they had lots of money and land for the vast majority. Some were slave owners, some were not. There are several of the framers or founding fathers, as they're sometimes called, who were against slavery. Benjamin Franklin is a primary note. However, in order to keep all of the states together, and you're going to see this this happening throughout this course and learning about the evolution of the United States and federal government, you have this southern versus northern slavery state versus industrial state dynamic. And it also manifests as an urban versus rural dynamic, which we will see. So there were social motives and economic motives for the Constitution. One, social motives maintain social order, which benefited them. And the second is economic motives, maintain property rights, which benefited them, of course. The slavery issue, they reached a compromise at the time, and they said there's no limits for 20 years in bringing slaves to the country, and then no more new slaves could be imported. However, slavery would continue with those born here, so it became a domestic industry, and but no new slaves were brought in past 1808. And second is when you saw the states putting together the compromise for the House of Representatives versus the Senate, Southern states said, wait a minute, in some cases, half their population were slaves, and they have to have all of these people who are there that require resources, etc. And they wanted power. They were worried that they would lose and no longer be able to have slaves, which was their free labor, which built the South's wealth completely almost. So they fought back, and they came to a compromise where each slave would be worth 3/5 of a person. It's actually written as any person who is not a citizen. So any free person, outside a free person. It could have been a slave, it could have been Native American, and many other different groups. So federalism, when we talk about it, it's how the power is divided between the national and state governments. And with federalism, you have a national federal government that's in the center, and that's considered supreme. So the states, their laws are not superior to the federal government. There's a supremacy clause, which we'll talk about in a minute, which states that the federal government reigns supreme. The state government has to follow the laws of the federal government. And the power is derived from the people. So the power is not coming from the states as it was in the Articles of Confederation to the federal government. The power comes from the people to the federal government, then to the states as well. So separation of powers was very important, and checks and balances. This was created, the French philosophers and others who had said any sort of republic you're going to create, you need to have checks and balances with these different branches of government, the legislative branch, executive, and judicial. We're going to get more into all of these things later in the semester. This is just an overview. So as you see in this slide, there's several checks that the different groups have on the other. So for example, we all saw it recently with former President Trump. He was impeached twice. He wasn't convicted. The Senate didn't vote. It's almost impossible to get a supermajority to vote on that. That's why it never happens. However, he was impeached twice in the House of Representatives, and this is a control on the president. You also see that Congress has checks on courts. So the court, Supreme Court for this case, or other federal courts, the president may nominate someone, but they have to be approved by the Senate. The congressional checks in the courts also is they can create courts and have. President's check on Congress, this is a big one. They can veto bills passed by Congress. So Congress, you can get a majority passing a bill, which nowadays, it's not just a simple majority in the House and the Senate, but usually, in most all cases, it requires a supermajority in the Senate over 60 votes because of the filibuster, which we'll talk about later this semester. So even if all that comes through, which is very unlikely, a president can veto, and then you need a supermajority, which is almost impossible to overturn a veto. So let's look at how the Articles of Confederation and the U.S. Constitution, how do they compare to one another? So formal name of the nation under the Articles of Confederation was the United States of America. And the Constitution actually wasn't specified, but is referred to in the preamble as the United States of America. Perhaps they thought it's already there, we're not changing that. The legislature, this is the Congress, was different. Articles of Confederation, it was unicameral, meaning there's one, each state had one vote in the federal Congress. The Constitution changed it, as we just talked about. Yet bicameral, meaning two different groups. One is the House of Representatives and one is the Senate. One's based on population, the House of Representatives, and the Senate is two for each state. The members of Congress could be a delegation between 2 and 7 members per state. It depended on the state. However, they'd only get one vote, regardless of how many they brought. And as we just said, 2 senators per state, and then representatives were according to the population, which at the time was 30,000 people. Now we're reaching close to 1 million per representative. Voting in Congress, again, 1 vote per state delegation, and 1 vote per representative or senator in the Constitution. Appointment by state legislatures in which each legislature directed. So appointment of members was however each state thought to appoint members. It was up to them. So they could have a wide variety of different ways. However, the Constitution made it centralized and uniform, and the representatives were elected by popular vote. Senators appointed by state legislators at first. And this was changed in 1913 with the 17th Amendment, where then senators were voted on by the people. A term of legislative office was 1 year, so not very long. And then now we know that 2 years for representatives and 6 years for senators right now. And term limits, there are none current in the Constitution. However, initially there were, and there was no more than 3 of every 6 years to rotate people through there. So when Congress was not in session of the Articles of Confederation, a committee of states had the full powers of Congress, so it kind of would disappear. And under the Constitution, they said that's probably not a good idea. And so the President of the United States can call on Congress to assemble at any time. The chair of the legislature was the President of Congress, again, the person who presided over Congress. And now it is the Speaker of the House of Representatives, with the Vice President serving as the President of the Senate. So so he is presiding over the Senate. The executive, there was none under the Articles of Confederation. We did have presidents, but they had no power. Constitution, we created the president, who does have power. The judiciary, there was none, with exception of the maritime judiciary, which means that was for issues at sea. Other courts were all up to the states. In the Constitution, they established the Supreme Court, as well as other federal courts that Congress deems necessary, which they've created several over the years. So who is the adjudicator of disputes between states? So if states are fighting, how is it handled? It's Congress under the Articles of Confederation. In the Constitution, said no, too political, we're going to give it to the Supreme Court. New states, initially, so you needed a supermajority at the time, 9 of 13, to agree, and with a special exemption provided for Canada. So they really wanted Canada to grow. They said, hey, if the Canadians want a province wants to come this way, we'll be more apt to accept it. And that was changed, and you just need a majority of Congress under the Constitution. Amendment, again, all states' power here when agreed upon by all states. And then the Constitution, it's when agreed upon by 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of the states, which we'll talk about in a second. Navy and Army, Articles of Confederation, it was really up to the states to pay for and provide any sort of military. However, it was organized at the federal level through Congress. And then that changed in the Constitution, of course. The power to coin money used to be the United States and the states, and that led to lots of problems. Now, under the Constitution, it's the United States only. Taxes, another big issue, was you could have taxes by Congress, but they were collected by the states. And oftentimes that money never made it to the federal government. Instead, the Constitution had the taxes levied, that means created and implemented, and then collected by Congress, or Congress has created the IRS later to do the work for them. Ratification, you needed unanimous consent required. And for the Constitution, it was the consent of 9 states, which was a supermajority. So structure of the Constitution. And know these basics here with which article means what. So Article 1, it talks about the creation of the legislative branch, which we talked about. And there's enumerated powers. When we use that term, it means it's specifically mentioned in the Constitution. It's not implied. Implied means it's not specifically mentioned. However, it's implied through the enumerated powers list, that are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. And the necessary and proper clause is also part of Article 1. Says, hey, if we don't specifically say something, it's also called the elastic clause. If it makes sense, provided enumerated powers before it, then these are implied powers, and that's to be decided by the Supreme Court. Article 2 spells out the executive branch, making the president not only president of the executive branch in the nation, but the commander-in-chief of the military, and giving the executive branch the authority to make treaties and federal appointments. Of course, they need to be approved by the Senate, and execute the laws faithfully. So the executive branch is all about implementing the law. They don't create laws. They execute the laws, which means that the laws are created by the legislative branch, and then the executive branch has to implement them and carry them out. Article 3 lists the judicial branch, and Article 4 through 7 contain many different clauses and such, which was mentioned in the text. Make sure to know them. Full faith and credit, a supremacy clause, which we mentioned earlier, this federal law trumps any state law, and the amendment process itself, which we'll talk about later. So full faith and credit is very important. And basically it says that one state has to respect the laws and contracts and rulings of another state. So they can't say, no, because this was tried in one state, and let's say if it's in state court, we don't recognize that in California because it was Louisiana. You can't do that. They have to recognize it. That's when you had some states allowing same-sex marriage, and had the marriages, they had to be recognized even in states that didn't have same-sex marriage. So the Constitution needed to be ratified, and this took, as you read in the text, just a couple years. It didn't just happen overnight. The country had been going through, the critical period, and had a lot of issues and problems. And this birth of the Constitution created Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. The Federalists favored strong national government. They wanted the Constitution. They were the drivers behind the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists favored the strong state governments. And we'll talk about some of the differences between the two. The Federalist Papers were very popular, especially now because they are used often by academics to say, well, and those in law to say, well, what did they really mean? These are our framers. What did they mean by X, Y, and Z that was put in the Constitution? Oftentimes, then they reference the Federalist Papers, which are 85 essays, to say, oh, this is what they meant, because they told us in this, or that. Now, does that mean it's law? No, but it is used often in legal arguments and in political arguments. It's theoretical, it's scholarly. It wasn't something like common sense. It was in every household where people were reading it, and going, yeah, we need to, kick them out. This was more of an academic, scholarly works that had a much smaller audience. So winning support for the Constitution took some time. 2 small states initially, ratified quickly, and these were Delaware, and then we saw that the emphasis on the population and granting the Senate with equal rights for all the states. They said, let's vote on this, get it approved now before they change their mind, the big states. So Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. This is a very generalization. This is from the text. This is obviously not every Federalist or Anti-Federalist fell into this these brackets. This is a very overgeneralization. So Federalists generally were property owners. When they say landed rich, older money, merchants from Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. And so we see very urban, wealthy. The Anti-Federalists were small farmers, shopkeepers, laborers, generally from rural areas, not urban, and from the South. The Federalists had an elitist political philosophy. So they saw themselves and those of their class as the most fit to govern. They were more educated, and that others were to be governed. Anti-Federalists were more populist. They believed in the decency of the common man and more of a participatory democracy, viewed elites as corrupt. They sought greater protection of individual rights. You see how these things still survive today when we look at red versus blue state and urban versus rural perspectives. The type of government favorite, obviously the Federalists wanted the Constitution, powerful central government, two-house legislature, upper house, further removed from the people, kind of like the old Roman Senate. And they distrusted the people. Alexander Hamilton, they have a great musical with him and all this, and he's a man of the people, but in reality he was fairly elitist and thought that the people would ruin everything, and so they needed to be governed. The Federalists wanted stronger state governments. They liked the Articles of Confederation, very similar to your red states now, more of a rural perspective. And they wanted a unicameral legislature that was all voted the same, similar to Articles of Confederation. Now this says pro-British, anti-French, and anti-British, pro-French. There's some truth to that, but that's not necessarily true across the board. So, methods of amending the Constitution. There are two methods, and one is 2/3 members of both houses. So the House of Representatives and Senate have to approve it. So a supermajority in both. And then it goes for ratification, and that's a vote in the state legislature where 3/4 of the states have to say yes. And that would be 38 states now, obviously not then. And that is 99% of the time the way things work. Actually, excuse me, that's 100% of the time the way things work. The other option is 2/3 of the state legislatures can come up with an amendment and then have it ratified in 3/4 at a convention. That's never happened. Informal methods are more popular, and we're seeing that now with the leaked opinion, for overturning Roe v. Wade in the Supreme Court. That's not law yet, but that's the way things are looking. And you see that how the Supreme Court interprets law is an informal method of amending the Constitution. So if we see Roe v. Wade overturned, which looks likely, you're going to see a change to the Constitution essentially through what we call precedent. And that's when the Supreme Court rules on these items to interpret the Constitution. And yes, they can overturn themselves, which was what they're doing in Roe v. Wade. So, and we'll talk about that more later in the semester. So social and cultural change, legislation can alter balance of power between government and the states. Things happen over time. And then technological change, when they drafted the Constitution, they had no idea that the current media would exist. They would have called it the devil and burned down the building. But the reality is, things change, and what is free speech and what does it apply to? Is it just books? Is it radio? Is it television? Is it social media, etc.? So the Bill of Rights was very important. A lot of the big states, to get them over the edge to sign, Massachusetts, eventually New York, one of the last to sign, they said, listen, we're not going to sign it. Then you had some smaller states, especially in the South, that were not going to jump on board until there was a Bill of Rights protecting individual rights. So once they had the Constitution ratified, and they didn't have all the states then they said, look, we'll put the 10 amendments. Actually, originally it was 12, but 10 were ratified in the states of the 12. And then we have the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments that passed. So First Amendment, we've talked about probably many times in many different courses, but we can read through each one of these. We see initially that the first thing mentioned is no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So they didn't want it to be Europe with a centralized church like you saw with the Pope, or what you saw in England, where the Church of England had lots of power. They wanted nothing to do with that. And this also, then you get to freedom of speech, of the press, which is the fourth estate, considered one of the most important parts of any democracy, and the right of people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Second Amendment, we have a lot of talk about that. It doesn't say everyone should have a gun, but it does say well-regulated militia, and that's necessary for the security of a free state and the right of the people to keep and bear arms. It's a bit gray. That's why we have a lot of debate on this back and forth. Shall not be infringed. So does it mean not be infringed in the context of militia or individually? That debate's raged for ages. Third Amendment, this was big because we're coming off of the Revolutionary War. And even though it was 10 years later, there's still a lot of bad blood there. And they said, no soldier shall in the time of peace be quartered in any house without consent of the owner. So let's not put soldiers in people's houses, not even during time of war, because that is not a popular thing to do. Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. This again is a reaction to the British, during and prior to the Revolutionary War. And no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. So you have the probable cause clause saying that there has to be some reason to do this. It can't just be because they feel like it. And this must be done through the judicial system, as later was implied. Fifth Amendment, we often hear pleading the fifth, not putting yourself in jeopardy, but actually it has a lot more in there. And it says no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or militia, or during war. So, or public danger. That's the gray area. But generally, it's saying you need a grand jury says, hey, has to review items. Again, very gray. The Constitution was not very specific. What constitutes a infamous crime? Capital, of course, is major, so that will be considered. But a grand jury has to come and say, hey, we're going to prosecute it. We're not going to. And then you have the due process clause in here as well. It cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So we see in PA 200, we talk about this eminent domain. When the government comes in and says, we need this for a highway or whatever, they have to provide just compensation to the property owners. Sixth Amendment, again, looking at the rights of the accused. And this saying that it has to be an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed. So a jury of their peers. And we look at the Seventh Amendment. It says controversy shall exceed $20. Back then, $20 got you a lot more than it does now. The right of a trial by jury shall be preserved. So yes, you can get a jury trial that has to be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined by any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Meaning, so you can't just keep trying something here and there until you prosecute someone. Once it's done, you can't try it again. The only way you can, this is through common law, it's going to an appeals court of some sort, appellate court. Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. This is often brought up in cases we see now where in California they've revised some of the bail requirements because they felt there was inequitable elements to it. The Ninth Amendment, the enumeration of the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So that's basically saying there's rights that aren't mentioned here, and we can't cover everything. And this doesn't mean if it's not here, it's not a right. So there's rights that could come up later that we didn't cover because we can't think of everything. And the 10th Amendment, which says the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So this is saying, hey, if it's not a federal issue, if it's not in the Constitution, then the states are able to make their own decisions. And that's a massive, massive gray area that has been debated for centuries and will continue to be just based on the structure of the government. So that's all we have. You made it through the first lecture. You're probably by now sound asleep, which is good. You get a good night's rest. And I will be speaking with you soon for chapter 3 in this module later this week.